Does imperialism benefit U.S. workers? Uh, Tonight's reading was specifically brought to you by Charlie Post. Some of you may have noticed a lot of tonight's reading, actually all of it, is by Charlie Post. Charlie is a longtime socialist activist who teaches at the City University in New York. Throughout this presentation, you will see GN and GS many times. Those are going to be short acronyms for Global North and Global South. I just want to go ahead and state that because you will see that many times. It was just too many words to fit on the slides. So to start, here are some questions that I think everyone should just kind of ponder throughout the presentation, and that we will try to answer these as we go through the presentation. And these questions are, does the global North benefit from the imperialized global South? Do workers of the global North benefit from the exploitation of those in the global South? Could this also be vice versa? Can we identify sections of the working class that benefit more than others? Can the relation between industry, monopolies, and corporate competition and exploitation, or what is the relation between these? Pardon. So we're going to start with a little bit of history here. Uh, in August of 1914, many socialists in Germany were very surprised when suddenly the entire German parliament voted to support the war, not just any war, but what would go on to become World War II. And now this was something that socialists in Germany had vehemently opposed and fought against for decades. So it was a very big surprise when it happened, and a lot of socialists took it as a pretty big defeat during the time. But there were those that were not convinced to support it. They felt betrayed by the socialist parties that chose to conform and capitulate to the empire, but they wanted to move forward. And they wanted to find, more importantly, they wanted to find other people like them who were resistant to this type of change. So they set out to accomplish two major things. One, they wanted to build a left anti-war, anti-imperialist wing of the revolutionary socialist movement. This would act as a base for international socialist actions, while globally every democratic socialist party, except for the US and Italy, had voted to support their own ruling classes in the World War. There were still those who resisted, like I mentioned, and those were the ones they wanted to reach out and bring into their organization. The second thing that they wanted to do was they wanted to determine how this came about. How could such a betrayal of values that they've fought for decades just be thrown aside by the democratic socialists? What caused these workers to apparently abandon this cause? So first, let's get a little bit of insight from our favorite Rosa Luxemburg on reform. Uh, Many socialists chose to capitulate to the desires of the state because they adhered to the democratic socialist model, many of which were ideas developed by Kautsky, who we'll get into in just a second. But unlike Kautsky, Rosa Luxemburg had a much better sense of the events that led up to 1914 that created the environment around what would be a series of mass strikes across all of Europe. Rosa voiced reservations about the Democratic Socialist Party as early as 1906, particularly with the organization's party and full-time officialdom with elected representatives and a massive apparatus for putting out newspapers, overall becoming very corporatized and akin to the very organizations that she aimed to disassemble. In 1910 and 1911, there was a debate on how to reform voting rights in Russia. The bulk of the party, including Kautsky, claimed that they should win the election and change electoral law through parliament. And we know how that works out. Rosa instead insisted that the only way to revolution is through mass strikes and mass action, an idea that Kautsky outright rejected. So I need to go back a little bit more and do a little bit more background here before we get into it. So don't get too much whiplash here because now we're going to go back to Marx and do a brief summary of Capital. I would say that the three major points that Marx tries to set out in Capital to show how surplus labor is extracted from all of us. These three main ways are through time extensions to the workday or workday expectations and duties, with no real change in no real change in our wages. Also through increasing the productivity of labor, which can be anything from your boss just simply increasing your workload, moving deadlines, or providing new technology that ideally allows you to passively get more done every day. The third way is by keeping wages as at historically low levels based on the worker capacity and time expenditure. So basically, we are working the same hours in our day, maybe even more, and yet we have a lower standard of living than we used to. Jumping back to the betrayal of the Socialist Democrats in supporting the World War uh, and the search for an explanation, with Lenin on Kautsky's side, they come up with an explanation to this lack of class consciousness and the betrayal of the Socialist Party, and they call it the labor aristocracy. Now, they define the labor aristocracy as individuals that are part of a middle class. Typically, they're intellectuals, and most of all, they do not understand Marxism. If they themselves are not particularly privileged, they find existence amongst those that are relatively privileged workers. And these are workers who accept the status quo and they see it as the only possible way of existence. uh, these people are the first to capitulate to the goals of the empire. Lenin and Kautsky tried to update some of Marx's theory with what they saw in the forming of monopolies and observations on how corporations compete against one another in the nation state and global levels. But ultimately, the backbone of this argument revolved around the idea of accumulated super profits from investing in what we call today the global south. Now, today, Kotskyists may claim that the viability of imperialist capitalism depends upon the super exploitation of workers in the global south, going on to state that wages that are below the cost of reproduction fuel the outsourcing of industrial production to the global south, which in turn allows imperialist firms to enjoy healthy profits without increasing the labor productivity or the rate of exploitation of the workers in the global north. Now, there's a number of issues with this argument. First, it rejects Marx's argument that the growth of labor productivity uh, increases increases relative to surplus value. Marx argued that as long as the rate is increasing wages is less than the rate of increasing labor activity, the intensification of work through the machinations produces more value within the same amount of time. So there's essentially just no need to go about it that way. Kautsky, however, would argue that Marx was looking at the imperialist core of the mid-19th century, not at contemporary society, and would go on to claim that capitalists in the global north and south do not compete with one another simply because they produce different commodities, and they are not compelled to increase labor productivity. He would also go on to claim that in Marxist time, capitalists in the core only exploited their own workers, and as a result, capital in the 19th century did not depend on profits from periphery investments or foreign investments. So now that I've laid out Kautsky's theory around labor aristocracy, let's take a few more looks at it and get some critiques in here. To start, The percent of capitalist profits from the global south represent no more than 50% to 20% of their total profits. Further still, it accounted to no more than 2 to 3% of wage packages for these countries. Wage packages are money allocated for staffing of employees, even management, supervisors, all the way up, whatever it costs to put people in there to run it, to do the people part. Additionally, there's significant data that shows that industries that pay higher wages are not industries that are more monopolized or that have more investments in the global south. Instead, they have a higher capital output, meaning they're making more things. In this instance, the costs of materials and machinery make up the bulk of the cost, not the actual wages of salaried individuals. To go down to the level of the worker, between 1912 and 1914, there was a wave of mass strikes across Europe. The people who led these strikes, the most radical and persistent individuals, were often amongst the best paid and most skilled workers in their industry. This was the bulk of the Russian socialist movement during that time that would go on to become the wings of the socialist movement throughout all of Europe. Thus, we can see the reality that the betrayal of the Socialist Democrats was not a direct result of the working class being bribed with higher wages or better security. So when a company makes a foreign investment, where does all the money go? Most foreign investments, counter to what Lenin and Kotsky believed, does not go from the global north to the global south. Instead, about 80% of it stays domestic, with only 20% of that investment actually going abroad. And then even there, only 3/4 of that 20% goes from one imperialist country to another. This has only changed to be less true over the last few decades with the rise of China, as they've become a more prominent figurehead in the capitalist space. To further disparage this argument, when US companies invest abroad, they mostly invest in Canada, Western Europe, and Japan, not Latin America, Africa, or Asia, which throws a huge wrench into the global now North versus global South argument. So I've been very critical of Kotsky's takes on the labor aristocracy. But there's actually a little bit of room where we can say that they're not totally wrong on this. Uh, we can reference a study by Ahmet Tanak, who provided details of the average exploitation rate of the global south compared to that of the global north. Now, there's a little bit of nuance here, so pay attention to the numbers. According to Ahmet's study, economies in the global north, being the US, Germany, Sweden, and Canada, saw rates of surplus between 202% and 259% between 1969 and 1977. While at the same time, around the same time, 7 economies in the global south, being Egypt, Turkey, India, South Korea, Bolivia, Panama, Puerto Rico, and Malawi, they all experienced rates between 244% and 465. And now that is a pretty big gap, but we'll see in the early 21st century that while that gap persists, it's narrowed quite a bit. The rate of exploitation in the US was estimated to be around 300% in 2001, while Turkey was sitting at a percent of 312 around 2006. So there we see only a 12% difference between the North and the South, being the US and Turkey, whereas it was over 200 in the previous examples given. And so although the rates of exploitation are higher, or they can be higher in the South, there's still evidence of increasing rates of surplus value and labor productivity in the global North as well. And this same study found higher rates of exploitation in the global South. It found that the rate of exploitation in the US jumped over 40% between 1948 and 1989. and then from 170% to 244%, before increasing another 18% from 1899 to 2001 to 225%. Another study documented a rise of 18% in the 1990s. Kim Moody's research demonstrated that a rapid increase in the US rate of surplus was the result of gains in labor productivity. Most of these increases were through the productivity of labor-saving technology, both directly through automation and technology that monitors and surveils workers in order to squeeze more labor out of their day-to-day work. Now, another idea of Kotsky's that gets brought up in this conversation is that the entire working class of an imperialist country are part of the aristocracy. The biggest issue with this is that it idealizes what class struggles should look like and disparages any worker that cannot or is not willing to be consistently involved in the struggle all of the time. And this also robs workers in the global north of their own agency to idealize this. I'm sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself here. This robs workers of the global north of their own agency, but it also idealizes the struggles of the global south, oftentimes putting the burden of change on the most impoverished workers in the global south. If this means waged employees in the global north are not revolutionary because they're a part of the working class, the same can also be said about workers that are part of the global south. And yet we can go back and forth bickering on this, but during the 1960s, we see a large number of strikes erupting across most of the global north and the global south. South, we had South Africa, Brazil, Mexico, South Korea. And in the north, we had France and Italy that made huge strides during their participation in the strikes. And we also had a revolution in Portugal that saw the full collapse of a capitalist state. So we can see the idea that all the workers under an empire are bought off just doesn't really work. It idealizes that what workers should be doing without understanding or directly downplaying the role that capitalism plays in exploiting workers. The next Kotsky argument that we'll take on is the investment in global south benefits all workers in the global north. And this one is unique in that it's not completely wrong, but what it isn't is a sort of unequal exchange. That is, it's not a manipulation of trade or transfer of value to the global south. Much of the production of consumer goods are produced in the global south, being food, clothing, much of our electronics, and they come at a cheaper rate because of this. This in turn raises the standard of living for all of the workers in the global north, benefiting off the cheaper sources of food or more affordable commodities in general. But at the same time, this reduces their labor power by removing their capability of reproduction. They are not the ones that have the means to create things. I cannot make a PlayStation. All of that capability rests in a different country. I don't have direct access to that. And that allows higher capital in the global north to allow a higher standard of living with a related rate of exploitation. All workers in the global north benefit from investments in the global south, and that more consumption leads to more exploitation. But simultaneously, the threat of moving work out of the global north is a powerful threat to negotiate declining living standards amongst workers in the north. The empire pits one group of workers against another through threats of moving work to the global south or bringing in foreign workers, creating a downward spiral for workers in all parts of the world economy. Kotsky and Lenin argued that the premise of monopoly capitalism, but this changes with the development of monopolies. Many leftists will make the claim that these corporations have the power to set their own price, and they do that to some extent. But to think that they can do this at will and suppress real competition is not a logical assumption. The problem is, again, we've come to another idealization, this time with how capitalists compete with one another. In reality, competition is fought for more and more on a global scale. To summarize this idea, surely you wouldn't suggest that Walmart can force producers in the global south to lower their costs at will so that they may adjust their own. Though this happens, it's not necessarily at will, and it's not free of restriction or competition as other people will play it out to be. To address the argument that this is an unequal exchange between the global north and the global south, Marx would say that goods aren't sold by their actual value, but by the price it takes to produce them, meaning that the process of competition tends to equalize profits across an industry. This means higher rates of surplus labor are accumulated through more capital-intensive firms. This is an assumption that rests upon the production of goods in the global south being cheaper. But as I've previously stated, the bulk cost of these things mostly comes from the raw materials and not employee salaries. The steel beams don't suddenly become cheaper to buy simply because you're in the global south. Instead of workers in the global north sharing in the benefits of the super exploitation of workers in the south, workers in both zones of the capitalist world economy have experienced rising rates of exploitation since the 1980s. Using labor share of GDP as a proxy for the rate of surplus value, a recent study argues that the moving of labor-intensive production processes to the periphery has intensified the global rate of exploitation of labor, as workers across the world are forced to compete with one another. Capitalists in the global north have used the mere threat of offshoring operations to the south to drive down wages and intensify work since the 1980s, and simultaneously benefit from mass migrations of workers from the periphery who enter the core labor markets without the minimal protections that citizen workers enjoy. Rather than exclusively benefiting workers in the global south, imperialism in the late 20th and early 21st centuries has produced greater levels of exploitation in the entire global working class. So as we near the end of this presentation, some of you may be thinking about the questions from earlier in this presentation. How should we explain to workers who respond by accepting the status quo or reformist politics? Well, we should start with a non-vulgar explanation of what working class consciousness is. That is something that is direct and honest in our approach, but is also not overbearing. Link working class consciousness to working class activity struggle and organization, and stand in solidarity with one another. This is something that Rosa Luxemburg understood all too well, that the working class will develop radical and revolutionary ideas naturally when they work together against capital or the state and engage in struggle that challenges authority, whether that's the employer or the state. We must focus on building broad solidarity amongst each other, overcoming racism, sexism, xenophobia in all of its forms, and confront employer and the state as our enemy. This may sound easy and acceptable to some of the revolutionaries on this call, but to many others, this is extreme enough to be an expectation to chase them away. The basic reality is the worker must compete with other workers for jobs because they are not able to produce their own conditions outside of our wages. When you go on strike, you're either not given a paycheck or you're paid less than you're used to. So it's something a lot of people cannot or are not willing to maintain for a long period of time. Once a movement begins to drag on, most people will go back to their mundane 8-hour day to make huge profits for their bosses. It's not that they aren't apathetic to the cause. They are merely consumed with the daily grind that sustains the things that they care about, making sure that they have a place to live, that there's food on the table, that their kids are able to go to school, etc. So what do they want? Well, to be honest, they want somebody else to be there to make sure that things don't get any worse. And if possible, make things better. They don't believe that they can struggle look towards the people that remain active to continue the struggle for themselves. Now, most of the remaining active people in a struggle, they won't go on to become officials in the workers' upsurges, but perhaps they still want to remain as activists and they want to try to uphold the struggle. Uh, Even fewer still are individuals that go on to be full-time union trade officials. Now, when this happens, their life has changed significantly. Even if they are not paid more than the people that they represent, which oftentimes they are, their conditions are more like those of the middle class professional and not the average worker who is producing just the average crap on the assembly line, so to speak. Now, these people want to avoid going back to being a wage worker. They see the instruments as a means to itself. The union becomes a means to itself, an ends to itself, sorry. Uh, Instead of a means to transition to something better, it becomes a permanent fixture. For the majority of union supporting workers, as long as it produces results, they'll go along with it. But the problem arises when they are unable to, when some workers see the inability of the union to create meaningful change, or if they are always caving to concessions. It is seen as a sign they should become more individualistic and competitive within their workplace, getting ahead of others at their own expense. This can develop ideas such as racism, homophobia, sexism, in order to mentally get ahead of their peers. And this is the natural flow of capitalism, pulling workers to the right through a means of competition with one another. Uh, this is a natural machination, and this isn't through corporate bribery. So, where does this put us? Under capitalism, only a percent of the working class will be active at once, and we should carry that expectation with us. The idea that there will come a time where all the workers engage in solidarity is not likely. The counter to this is to develop a layer of workers that will constantly be there to fight, not to be confused with one person who carries all the weight always, but more of a working class vanguard. Now, to end this presentation, I revisit the question that Rosa Luxemburg poses. Should we reform to these capitalisms of exploitation or work towards a radical transformation that brings about more agency to the working class? Capitalism cannot be reformed. Its greed can never be sated. We will never know anything but exploitation under this regime. Additionally, the hunger of the capitalist state has never been sated. It devours the very resources we depend on to sustain our species long term and poisons our world as an added bonus. Make no mistake, I say capitalism will destroy us all, not the earth. All matter of insect and microbial bacteria will undoubtedly find a way to survive in the mess we leave behind. But you can call me an optimist when I say that the potential for a revolution is there. The real question becomes, can we pull ourselves together in time? And I end this with a quote from Hassam el-Hamawi, who is an Egyptian socialist and writer. It's foolish to dismiss the working class of the West, because my liberation as someone of the South will never be achieved unless power falls away from the global North.